Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Bridgehead. As most of you know, we've been having a discussion on this show for the last couple of months on how Christians can respond to our culture. And one of the interviews that was most popular among people was my interview with Rod Dreher, who recently wrote a book called The Benedict Option, where he advocates for a strategic retreat back into our communities to rebuild Christian communities so that we actually have the spiritual and intellectual forces to withstand the secular storms that are coming and many of us would point out are already here. And I thought it was a very good book. It's been a very controversial book because a lot of people object to certain points that he makes, especially concerning the value of retreat when Christian communities seem under attack. And there's a couple of other books that have come out recently as well. One of them is called Empires of Dirt, which is by Douglas Wilson of Christ Church in Idaho, which is very good. But the best book that I have read on this topic of the last few months has to be Professor Anthony Esolen's book, Out of the Ashes, Rebuilding American Culture. It's really just a beautiful book to read. It's a pleasure from the literary sense. It's a pleasure in that his analysis is easily as depressing as Rod Dreher's in many ways, except for the fact that he addresses each cultural crisis with a very practical solution. So rather than finishing the book and feeling depressed and helpless, he instead advocates for small things we can do on the community level, on the home level, on the church level, everything from returning to the great spiritual and Christian music of the past to re-engaging with the intellectual and literary heritage of Western civilization, to just learning how to be naturally human again, from just rejecting all of the lies that have been accepted by the political and intellectual elites of society. And he's very well positioned to do this. He's a writer and a teaching fellow in residence at Thomas More College of the Liberal Arts in Merrimack, New Hampshire. He's written a number of other great books that some of you may have read before. He wrote The Politically Incorrect Guide to Western Civilization, which was published by Regnery Press in 2008. He published 10 Ways to Destroy the Imagination of Your Child, which a lot of my friends, young parents, have read and highly recommend. And his book, Defending Marriage in 2014, attempted to really break down what the gay marriage debate meant. He's written other books as well, but Out of the Ashes, I think, is probably his most spectacular. I couldn't put it down when I was done reading it. My wife began reading it, then my dad borrowed it, and it's a beautiful book is the best way I can put it. And he essentially advocates for a cultural chemotherapy that correctly identifies what the problems are, correctly identifies how postmodernism has crept into Christian communities and crept into our own lives, and then just advocates for a Christian lifestyle, Christian culture, and Christian communities that by the time you're done his book will seem attainable, even though he points out that postmodernism is in stage 4, that our culture is in crisis. He pulls no punches. He says things in a way that is even far more politically incorrect than Rod Dreher himself does. But at the same time, when you're done the book, you'll feel like you have a better handle on where we are and where we need to go from here. So I've been trying to set up an interview with him for a couple of weeks now. We've been missing each other because he's been moving and visiting Cape Breton, which he does every summer with his family. But today we finally connected and had that conversation, and I'm sure we'll be having many others, and I hope you all get as much out of the conversation as I did. Well, just to start off, before we get into talking about your book, it's interesting because in the book you discussed how those who hold to traditional values will often be forced to suffer for them. And I understand you've just left your previous and much beloved job at Providence College and you've switched locations.
Yeah. For 27 years I taught at the college that shall remain nameless. And for 25 or 25 and a half of them, I thought I had the best academic job of anybody I knew. I really loved the job. I thrived in it, and then the college decided to take a sharp turn towards identity politics. And when I wrote a couple of articles asking people what the heck they mean by cultural diversity when they don't seem to be interested in studying any culture at all besides the one they happen to be living in, and that from a political angle. It's all contemporary Western identity politics. Well, I had to be slandered by the administration twice in front of 5,000 people. I had to be called all kind of filthy things, and it's all untrue. It was disgusting and vicious. And then I suddenly realized that the place that I had loved no longer existed. It had sold its soul over to politics. So now I'm at a new college. New for me. It's about, I think it's 40 years old or so. Thomas More College of the Liberal Arts, a faithfully Catholic small school in New Hampshire that deserves a lot more support than your typical alma mater deserves.
And that leads right into one of the things you highlight in your book over and over and over again, and you always say that politics takes up way too much space in our lives, that in order to engage and live as Christians in modern culture, for most of us, instinctively we think of politics. How are we going to get the right people elected? How are we going to ensure that, people who defend religious liberty are put in those positions? But you make the very compelling point that politics has driven out so much in our lives that is necessary and has taken up a inordinate amount of space.
Yeah. Whenever I use the word politics, I have to be careful of the context, because in its original meaning, right, in the way that Aristotle would have used it, or Plato or Socrates, it meant that those things having to do with the polis, and the polis was relatively small, self-governing. We might call it city-state or county. Something smallish on the size of ancient Athens, which is probably no bigger than the state of Delaware, the whole of the Athenian state. So it meant being concerned as a member of a free, self-governing thing, being concerned with the common good and taking actions for the common good. Now, if you put it that way, the problem with the United States now is, and perhaps many other Western countries, is not that we have too much politics, but we have almost none that's left. I mean, there's almost nothing that local, ordinary people can do by way of securing the common good for themselves and their children. It's all been taken up by mass politics, which is maybe a different kind of monster entirely. So I guess, we have to be concerned about whether we put irresponsible people or sane people in charge of Jabba the State. But I have a feeling that Jabba the State is going to keep on doing what it's doing, almost regardless of who we put there. The real question is, shall we somehow find a way to revive what's truly political, that is to say, has to do with the common good close to home? That's a big question, and that question has something, but not a whole lot, to do with elections.
In your view, is it possible for people to get on with their lives without being consistently interfered with by bigger government? The war over religious liberty seems to be an enforcing of a new morality from the top down, and when it's enforced from the top down, isn't there something to be said for trying to target those at the top?
Yeah, there's something to be said for it. It's part of the war at hand, right? But it's not the whole of it. It may not even be the most important part. It is part. It's part. One thing, for instance, you obviously. Let's take, for example, something again closer to home. Obviously, it's a good thing to find out whether the persons who are running for your local school board are sane or insane,
right?
And try to vote for those who are sane. But if you expect anything really good to come out of the local school system, then I think you're fooling yourself. So while you do what you can to ameliorate the disaster that is our public schooling, for your own children, and maybe also for the sake of other people's children other people who might use you as an exemplar, you get your own kids out of that. Get them out. I don't care what you do. Get them out. What are they learning there?
Right.
After 12 years, will they be able to read Milton's Paradise Lost? Almost certainly not. Will they have their morals intact? Almost certainly not. I mean, what good is it? Get them out. Teach them at home. Form a homeschooling co-op. Begin the arduous task of rebuilding private schools that respect the family and actually do want to impart the great tradition of learning to young people. There are such things that are being invented all over the place in the United States, and again, they need our support. But get them out of the poison vat. It's the first order of business. Get them out of there.
And that's an interesting point. The education point was part of that was the favorite part that I read, simply because it made a lot of sense to me due to the fact that I spent a lot of time researching them on what types of sex ed are being taught. I don't know how much you keep track of what's going on here in Canada, but the legislation that's being passed on almost an annual basis at this point lays the framework for further ensuring that no kid will emerge from these schools unscathed. The pro-life movement works very hard to reach out, for example, to immigrant communities who often have very traditional values.
Right.
Those immigrant communities are complaining that their children are losing their cultural heritage and traditions in one generation now because of the smartphone and internet porn, and they're basically turning out with the same terrible values as the postmodern white kids did. And how do you start to talk to parents about what's necessary and what's not? So just to give you an example, my parents raised us without a television because they said that they had no desire to compete with those they disagreed with for our values. And instead, they would buy us as many books as we could read. That was the limit, and we just had to read them. And so I got the opportunity to read a lot of the classics before the 7th grade because that's what was in front of me, and I really enjoyed it. But I find that experience, as limited as mine was compared to what you recommend in your book, it's so foreign to people that they can't even wrap their heads around it. I'm arguing with parents about their 12-year-old getting a smartphone. Much less just keeping them away from entertainment. How do you start to help parents, often they themselves having been sort of severed from the intellectual legacy of Western civilization, how do we go about convincing them to change the way they do things with their kids?
That's quite a question, isn't it? Especially when I think I'm trying to adjust my thinking now to Canada, which I love in a different way from the ways in which I love the United States. I love the people of Canada for their generosity, their cheerfulness. I wonder if an appeal can be made to Canadians on the basis of the common good that would strike American ears immediately a little bit suspicious, or you're not treating me as an individual.
Right.
Can Canadians still be persuaded that when their families are shot to hell because of the bad deeds of grown-ups, right? Begetting, bearing children out of wedlock, the chaos that ensues from that, from divorce at will. They can, if they can be made to look at the disaster that they leave for their children, could they be brought round to rethinking the sexual revolution on the basis of its effects on the common good? I think that can be done. That will require more than one or two people. It may require 50 years of persuasion.
Uh-huh.
If you have somebody though who retains more than a residue of allegiance to the Christian faith, okay, then you might be able to say to that person, hey, look, you know what your son, and daughter for that matter, but you know what your kid is going to be doing with that smartphone. You know damned well what he's going to be doing with it. Because, in fact, that's what you would have been doing with it, and, in fact, truth be known, that's what you sometimes yourself do with it, okay?
Right.
You look at porn. If you think for a moment that a 12-year-old boy is going to use his smartphone in order to read a classic work of literature or look at works of art that he'd never get to visit in person by Titian and Raphael and Leonardo and so on, then you're an idiot. He's going to be using the smartphone to look at porn. It's going to burn those images into his head. And if you think that he's only going to be looking at one kind of porn, you're also an idiot. You're an idiot. Why don't you just buy your kid a subscription to Hustler magazine? I would never do that. I would never want that in the house. Well, you're a fool. What do you think the smartphone is? Yeah. It's that to the 100th power. You're an idiot. There's nothing that the kid needs with that. You want to give the kid, a first-generation cell phone so that he can call you in case of an emergency. Okay, maybe, but otherwise, come on. What point does it have? And while all these kids are spending all that time on that, what are they not doing? They're not reading books. They're not going outside. They're not making anything with their hands. They're not learning anything. You're robbing them of their youth and their innocence, and most of their brain power too goes to waste.
So why did you write this book? One of the things that's interesting is there's been a lot of books in the last 5 or 6 years. They kind of discuss the end of culture as we know it and how Christians can properly respond. Your book, in some ways, painted one of the darkest pictures, but also was a lot more hopeful than other recent offerings. The way you step by step work through different cultural phenomenon and explain how Christians can respond, or how Christians can build something anew, was a lot different than, say, The Tactical Retreat of Rod Dreher's also very good book that I read recently, The Benedict Option. While you guys both had the same analysis to some degree, there was a lot more optimism just inherent in the solutions that you put forward.
Yeah, well, I think that I have. See, I've taught literature and history and philosophy and theology over the course of the last 4,000 years, right? I mean, I take the broad view of these things. I think Rod tries to do that too. I think he does. But I look at it this way. I say, all right, I'm not going to put a pretty face on anything that I see. It's ugly. It's absurd. And I know it. I am painfully aware of it because it's impossible for me not to be painfully aware. For instance, how ignorant college professors and college students are, because I read the private letters of people who lived 150 years ago, and I know damned well that it would be difficult for a college professor, forget about to write those letters, that never happened, but even to read those letters and make sense of them. And as for college students, not 1 in 100. Okay? I know this. Okay. However, I also know that if there are things that are perfectly natural and quite within the capability of human beings to accomplish, because they've accomplished them before, and they've accomplished them under more difficult material circumstances than we face now, because we are very wealthy. These things can be done again. Okay. Now, they're not necessarily things that are going to be dictated from the top down, and very rarely are they. But there is no reason, for instance, there is no reason at all why, to take a seemingly minor example, but I don't think it's minor. There is no reason why we have to sing stupid hymns in church. Protestants now sing stupid and heretical and trashy stuff. and so do Catholics. But there's no reason for it. There is no reason why human beings, ordinary human beings, cannot learn again what poems do, and what poems that reflect upon theology do, and what a hymn sounds like, what kinds of melodies congregations can sing. This is not, as they say, this is not rocket science. This is an ordinary thing. It's an ordinary human thing for people to get together and play rather than watch sports. Okay. Well, if the coal miners in the town where I grew up in, if they could do it, then we can do it. We have the capacity to do it. What's wanting is the will. But the will is under our control. Okay. I mean, a lot of these things are within reach of us. Again, now when I say us, I don't mean the mass culture out there. I mean Christians getting together to determine to do something. And what I have in mind are things that are normal and ordinary. It doesn't take Michelangelo. Okay, Michelangelo comes once in 1,000 years, but it doesn't take Michelangelo. It just takes ordinary people with clear heads and broad shoulders, willing to take up the shovel and start to dig out the rubble.
Well, it's very, very interesting because you say things that are normal, and normal is a very politicized word at the moment because you have a lot of media figures pointing to the behavior of members of the Trump administration and saying, this isn't normal, never start to think that this is normal. And regardless of the accuracy of that analysis, it's very hard to take people who are trumpeting the idea that men could get pregnant very seriously when they try to tell us what is and is not normal. How do we begin to, when the rest of the culture seems to have gone nuts? I published an article a while ago just listing off 10 statements that were controversial in 2017, one of them being men can't get pregnant. Things like that, which anybody with no education, with no literacy, would once have just instinctively known. This is why we have some immigrants coming from some places in the world that have not been privileged to be able to afford an education, yet are stunned by the number of stupid things we believe when they arrive, because they still have an instinctual knowledge that hasn't been sort of warped out of them yet. How do you go about restoring any sort of social consensus on normal to begin with?
Perhaps I should have used the word natural.
Yes.
Which is also loaded in a different way. It's natural. That is, it's in accord with human nature. And here the funny thing is, all of the sciences, the natural sciences, in this regard, are on our side. Mm-hmm. Okay, biology is on our side, and physics, the physiological facts of the human body, male and female, and the physics that flows from that. That's right. The typical male hand and arm are going to be able to do things that are different, a wider range of things than the typical female hand and arm. And you can't dispute that because the physics that flows from the physiology determines it. It's not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of observation. Anyway, we could say that anthropology is on our side too, because we have the witness of every single culture known to man at every stage of technological development and in every clime, okay? Everywhere you go, the world over and into the distant past, everywhere you go, men and women are recognizably men and recognizably women. That should be a remarkable thing, right? I mean, you read about you read the ancient Greek epics about Hector and Achilles, Helen and Andromache, and you immediately recognize the men as certain kinds of men and the women as certain kinds of women. There's no confusion there. And so our opponents here are building a house of sand. I mean, there's no foundation to it. We need to laugh at it, charitably if possible, but sometimes just frankly, to embarrass, and to say to people, look, this is frankly stupid. And not only is it stupid, but it's inconsistently stupid. Because on Monday you tell me there's no difference between the sexes. And then on Tuesday you say that this man over here is actually a woman in a man's body. Don't you realize that what you said on Monday makes it impossible for you to say that on Tuesday? Because there is no difference, according to you, on Monday between a man and a woman. So how can you be a man trapped in a woman's body if there are no differences? It's like saying, no, this thing is not red. It's red. It's completely absurd. One of the things I was getting to say before I got myself off track there is that if you're around people of goodwill who are not completely insane, I'm thinking here especially of fathers of sons, married men who have a young son. Okay. Those guys, I think, are not deluded because they don't want their sons hanging around people who want to hanging around guys who want to hang around their sons. They don't want that. You can appeal by your example. You say you show them this is what a normal human family looks like. You have these boys and girls behaving as boys, behaving as girls. They're happy. They're comfortable with their own sex. They're doing boy things, girl things, sometimes kid things they do together. They aren't hooked on porn. They don't have mouths that come out of a toilet. They look their elders in the eye and smile. And a lot of people, without knowing really what the heck you're doing, a lot of people will be attracted to that because it's natural and it's beautiful. And they'll say, how'd you do that? How'd you get that? I want to know. What are you drinking? And then, well, you win people over. You win people over that way. This is not going to be an easy thing. It's
right.
This is going to take a while. But I don't see any alternatives. There's as I say in the book over and over. Okay, it's a disaster out there. There's nothing really that's been left intact. So it's time to clear out the rubble and start building from scratch. So here's your shovel. You use it where you think you can do the best work there. Some people are going to have to shovel out the sewer that's backed up. Other people are going to have to see if we can get some decent food for the kids. All kinds of tasks need to be done. You can't do everything, but everybody can do some things. So, time to get to work.
Based on
sorry. That's the difference between my book and Rod's book.
Yes, very much so. And I was going to say, but based on your analysis of what our culture knows, doesn't know, and is capable of comprehending, I'm noticing that when you say people who aren't insane, who are people of goodwill, so there's a lot of people out there who just didn't care about gay marriage. They kind of go with the flow. But as postmodernism reaches stage 4, they begin to be, they're able to obviously identify the fact that these things don't work together. So to go a bit further on your example, that that there are no gender differences, but then there is transgenderism. To take it a step further, it's offensive to say that this is a female characteristic, yet this characteristic is used to prove that this man is a woman. So it's gone from something you can't say and a statement of no value to a statement of the utmost value, because it proves this fellow over here, who is clearly packing something that women don't, that fellow is obviously a girl because of that thing you weren't allowed to mention before. This is why you've got old guard feminists like Germaine Greer, who, once advocated the hookup culture as a way to break, and I quote, women's dog-like devotion to men. She's now run to the tolerance buzzsaw because she is upset that the idea that a man becoming a woman could ever identify with the female experience because they can't do something like menstruate. Like, this seems kind of normal for normal people, right? You know, guys making jokes about girls being grumpy during that time of the month is now something that nobody's allowed to laugh at because men also have their period, right? There's a lot of people out there who are kind of like, okay, when Joe and Bob got married, I was like, doesn't affect me, but this is different. This is crazy. Like, I'm not buying it anymore. There are a lot of people I run into who I'm able to say statements like, well, if you don't believe that men can get pregnant, you might think you're not on my side of the fence yet, but you're going to end up here because you are a transphobe. Just nobody said that to your face yet.
Oh, brother. Yeah, I know. I am going to be politically incorrect here, as I've been, right, and say that we have to. It might be useful for us to tailor what we say to the sex of the person to whom we are saying it, whether we are saying it eye to eye, one-on-one, or whether it's in the hearing of other people, and the age of the person, and whether that person is married with children or not. Okay, so to a man who is married and has a child, okay, especially if he has a boy, and there's no one else overhearing it, or only men are overhearing it, then I think you can be blunt. You can be quite direct, okay? And you can say, listen, pal, you're not fooling me, okay? Because if you had a 12, your boy is 8 now, and your boy is a good-looking boy. When he's 12, he's going to be a real good-looking kid. You tell me to my face that you would be okay with your kid having a sleepover with an older teenager, a boy, who had come out as gay. You look me in the eye and tell me that you'd be okay with that. And that kid, the older kid, has taken an interest in your son. You look me in the eye and say, "Oh, well, no, that's a little bit different. That'd be Why would you be uncomfortable with it?
Right.
Tell me why. Okay? Tell me why. Tell me why you would be crushed that your kid had been experimenting that way. Tell me. Well, because he'll be facing discrimination. Bullshit. It's bullshit. Because you don't want that for your kid. You want your kid to grow up healthy and in a natural way, so they'd be attractive to girls and attracted to them. You want him to do what you did, to take a woman in marriage and to have children. That's what you want for your son. And that is a normal thing, a natural thing, and you'd be wrong not to want it.
Right.
Right. I mean, you can put it to a guy right in his face.
Yes.
You say, listen, if you think there's no difference, okay? If you think there's no difference, then when you catch your teenage kid looking at porn, if you think there's no difference, why don't you recommend to him some gay porn? If there's no difference,
right?
If you don't care, why don't you say to him, well, why don't you try it out, see if you like it? Of course you wouldn't do that. There's no way you would do that. And there's no way that a man will say in the hearing of other men that he would be okay with this. There's no way. Because he knows immediately, that none of those guys will respect him. They'll start to think, maybe something up with this fellow. It's not natural, and they know it. Now, in the presence of women, they may take a different tack altogether. And this is why I think that women are best at talking to women head-to-head about these things, right? One-on-one, straight shooting, okay? I think if we mix the sexes on these issues, we get people digging into a certain to what they think sounds right in front of their wives. The men will do.
Right.
And frankly, I don't. When it comes to this sort of stuff about sex, I don't think you can talk about it frankly in mixed company. You know, I don't think it can be done.
Well, especially with fathers to sons. At schools they ask me sometimes because I give presentations on it, and a mother will put up her hand and ask, "Well, how do I talk to my son about this?" I said, "You don't. If there's no father in the house, find a brother that you trust, or maybe it's your father, but he's never going to ask you honest questions." Which kind of brings me to one of the reasons I loved your book is because, like I said in my review of it, it felt like cultural chemotherapy reading it. The way that it just you called things out even more bluntly than those of us who write columns on this kind of stuff weekly, because you clearly just had it. But you were fed up in an intellectual and articulate way, and for several hundred pages, and it was a very, very enjoyable read. And one of the things that crossed my mind is my grandmother's 90 years old now. Her long-term memory is fantastic. Her short-term memory is not so good. So she always asks me each time I go over there and visit her what I do for work, and I work full-time for a pro-life organization that works in the culture on persuading people that abortion is wrong. And she's known this for years, but now each time she'll say, "Yeah, so what do you do?" Right? And I'll tell her that I work for a pro-life organization, and she'll say, "Well, what is pro-life?" And I'll say, "Well, we're against abortion." She'll say, "Okay, what's abortion?" And I'll say, "Well, it's when somebody doesn't want their baby, so they get a doctor to get rid of it." And the look of horror on her face, when I said that, she had 11 children, and
right.
she lost one to miscarriage that still gets mentioned. When you go over to their house, the first thing my 90-year-old grandmother and my 95-year-old grandfather will do is walk you over to the enormous family picture, and then you get to reiterate what you said last time, which is such a nice family, and everybody's so good looking, and look at all the grandkids. But she said, when I explained to her what abortion was, she just said, like, "What do you mean not want their baby?" And that was it. Like, I couldn't actually get through to her on, and I just left it. I said, you've raised your 11 kids. There's really no reason for me to waste my time during my visit with you trying to explain the minds of other people that are much less pure than yours are. But that kind of struck me, that divide between the generation where the sort of thing that I'm so used to, it's something I talk about every day, and I debate with hundreds of members of the public. It's something my grandmother can't even really wrap her head around.
Yeah. There are plenty of things like that. See, this is one of the. Here's one of the uses of actually knowing something about the way people thought and lived before the day before yesterday. Okay, we get a perspective on our own times, and that's why I think it's one of the deeper reasons why our schools dispense with that. I've noticed in Canada, for instance, that I originally came here believing that I would find young people more conversant with British literature and the history of English literature in general than in the United States. And I find that the opposite is the case. That if anything, they're somewhat less likely here, even less likely here, to have a knowledge of, let's say, Milton or those than in the United States, which was already pretty bad. I don't know why that is, but if one of the things that happens when you actually read books that are older than 2 days is that you encounter women like your grandmother, okay, for whom it is simply incomprehensible that somebody would want to do away with a child. You also meet people, and I still meet people who talk to me this way, who tell me these things, that they have no idea what it is, what sexual perversions even were. Had no idea. Okay, one of my, I don't know if I quoted it in the book, but the actor Sal Mineo, who had totally screwed up youth, he was in reform school all the time. He's called a switchblade kid. When he made the movie Rebel Without a Cause, James Dean. He said later that if he and James Dean knew that there was anything that two guys could do with each other, they'd have done it. But they didn't know. Okay? That's Hollywood.
Right.
That's James Dean and a kid who by that time was about 18, 19 years old, a kid who had lived on the streets in Brooklyn his whole life. I mean, that kid you would think that kid would be exposed to everything.
Yeah.
He didn't know. Okay? And that's not that long ago, right? I mean, where was I going with this? We need to get our young people to be aware that the silly assumptions of their own time are out there. I mean, they're outliers. It's not just that old people would look upon them as silly. It's that every single human being on the face of the earth until the day before yesterday would have looked upon them not only as silly, but as insane, as bizarre, as if you would try to walk on your hands all day long. It's just crazy, okay? And the reason why they thought it was crazy, it's a kind of I make a joke about it. The Thomistic farmer who looks upon what two guys are doing and says, "That don't go there."
Yeah.
Right? And it doesn't go there. Anyway.
So one final question.
Yeah.
Just to encourage people to pick up the book, because I read it, and then before I even got finished it, my wife started reading it, and now my parents have read it as well. It's one of those books that's really refreshing because you're reading about cultural decline, but like as I mentioned earlier, with every single chapter, there's a sometimes difficult but always comprehensive and I think quite attainable solution to all of these different problems. I really want to encourage as many people to read it as possible. Just give us a brief synopsis of how you think Christians should approach culture and why you wrote the book.
Well, I wrote the book in order to start getting things done, not just to complain, but to urge people in a cheerful way, finally in a cheerful way. I mean, look, I'm not going to put a pretty face on the disaster there. It's
right.
a complete disaster, okay? But hey, you know what? It was a complete disaster on a Friday afternoon 2,000 years ago at Calvary. That was a complete disaster, too. It's time to put our muscles and our brains to work and get things done. Now, the first thing, the first chapter of the book may be the leading light of the whole, okay? And this is something that's well within our capacity. It's to clear our heads of lies, okay? There are lies that we are fed constantly from the media and from schools, every single minute of every day. Get rid of the lies. Clear your heads. Clear your heads of political slogans, transphobia. That's can't. That's a lie, okay? There is no such thing as a transgender person. There may be men trying to pretend that they're women and vice versa. Clear your heads of the lies, okay? And recommit yourself to truth. And truth is, the truths that I'm talking about in the book are not difficult to attain. They are immediately graspable, observable by ordinary human beings. You don't even need scripture to tell you that a man can't give birth, okay? And any 5-year-old could tell you that. Just look at farm animals. Come on. Clear your heads of all the lies, okay? That's the first, the foundational order of business. And maybe the end of it all is to remember where we're going, okay, as Christians. Remember that God, who is the author of nature, has an end for us that transcends even this nature. It is not counter to nature. It is not unnatural, but it builds upon the natural. Anyway, would that help?
Absolutely. And thanks a lot for taking the time to answer all these questions.
Oh well, I'm delighted. I'm delighted.